Annie Oakley raised the rifle, and the man laughed. It was the autumn of 1893, and the Columbian Exposition had turned Chicago into a city of impossible things. White plaster buildings rose from the lake shore, like monuments to a civilization that had not quite arrived yet, their facades lit at night by electric bulbs, so thick along the cornices they turned the whole fairground into something between a dream and a fever. The crowd came by the hundreds of thousands. Farmers from Indiana, merchants from New York, families who had saved for 2 years to make the trip. All of them pressing through the turnstiles, with their programs and their wonder, looking for something they could not name. The exposition was full of wonders. But in the open-air arena at the south end of the fairground, where the sawdust was thick and the smell of horses and gunpowder cut through the lake wind, the wonder had a name. Her name was Annie Oakley, and she was 33 years old, and she had not missed a shot in 4 performances. The man who laughed was named Gerald Crace. He was 41, broad through the chest, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from having money long enough that it feels like a natural feature of the world rather than a thing you acquired. He sat in the reserved section with his associates, 3 men in similar suits, similar mustaches, similar expressions of tolerant amusement, and he had been talking since the show started, not loudly enough to be thrown out, but loudly enough for the people around him to hear, and loudly enough for that sound to carry the way contempt always carries. Further than it should, further than it was meant to. He had said at various points in the preceding 40 minutes that the whole thing was rigged, that the clay pigeons were weighted to break at a touch, that the distances were half what they were announced to be, that a woman of her size could not possibly generate the control the exhibition claimed, and that her husband, standing at the far end of the arena releasing targets, was operating some mechanism that guided the shots home. He said these things to his associates, and they nodded, and he said them a little louder, and some of the people nearby turned to look at him, and he nodded at them too, as if sharing a confidence. Annie Oakley heard none of this. She was at the far end of the arena, 40 yards from the target stand, checking the chamber of her .22 Stevens by feel, the way she had checked every chamber since she was 9 years old, and the rifle was taller than she was. Her hands moved without instruction from her conscious mind. The crowd noise was present but distant, the way water sounds when you are standing at the bottom of a well. There was the target. There was the rifle. There was everything that existed between them. What was at stake was not the shot. She had made this shot 10,000 times. What was at stake was the thing behind the shot. The argument she had been making with her whole body for 20 years, in arena after arena, to audience after audience. The argument that what she did was not a trick, not a charm, not a product of favorable circumstance. It was skill, plain, earned, tested skill, and there were always men in the crowd who needed to disagree. Gerald Crace leaned toward his nearest associate and said, in a voice designed to carry, "She's got 1 bullet left. Watch her miss." The crowd went quiet the way crowds do when they sense that something is about to become true or become a disaster. Annie Oakley did not move faster. She did not change anything about her step, her breath, her grip. She raised the rifle. He was wrong. But that is not where this story starts, and it is not where it ends. To understand what happened in the 48 hours that followed, what it cost, what it revealed, and what it ultimately produced, you have to go back further than the shot. You have to go back to where the story actually began, which was not in the arena at all, but in a basement office on Michigan Avenue, 3 days before, where a young woman named Clara Briggs was sitting across a desk from a man who would not look at her, holding a folder of documents she had spent 11 months assembling, watching him make a decision that would unmake everything she had worked for. Clara Briggs was 26 years old in the autumn of 1893, and she had come from Decatur, Illinois, with specific and practical ambitions. She was the second daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who had once taught piano lessons before the piano was sold. And she had grown up understanding that the distance between wanting something and having it was made of hours, rather than luck. She had a gift for mathematics that her teachers had not known what to do with. Not the decorative kind of mathematical interest that young women were occasionally permitted to display, but a structural, load-bearing kind. The kind that let her look at a column of figures and see not just the numbers but the relationships between them, the pressures and balances and stresses that the numbers described. She had used this gift to teach herself bookkeeping, then accounting, then the particular branch of financial documentation that governed the administration of commercial exhibitions and traveling shows. She had come to Chicago because the exposition was the largest commercial operation in the country. And she had believed, with the particular stubbornness of a young person who has not yet been refused enough times to stop believing, that something that large would need people who could do what she could do. She had been right about the first part. The exposition employed bookkeepers by the dozen, accountants by the score. It had financial officers and administrators and men who oversaw other men, who oversaw other men. All the way down to the clerks who entered figures in ledgers, by gaslight in the basement offices of the Central Administration Building. Clara Briggs had arrived in Chicago 8 months before the exposition opened and had found herself a position as a junior accounting clerk in the office of a man named Harlow, who administered the financial records for 6 of the exposition's satellite entertainment operations, one of which was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In 8 months, she had found 3 significant errors in the accounts she managed. Not small errors, not rounding differences, but structural miscalculations that had caused 2 vendors to be significantly underpaid and 1 to be significantly overpaid, in each case by amounts large enough to have legal consequences if not corrected. She had documented each error carefully, traced each one to its source, and prepared clear written reports explaining the problem and its solution. The first report had been received by Harlow with acknowledgement, filed and never acted upon. The underpaid vendors continued to be underpaid. The second report prompted a meeting in which Harlow told her, in a measured voice, that her analysis was interesting, but that she should understand that accounts of this complexity required a perspective she did not yet have, and that the figures she believed to be errors were in fact the result of arrangements she was not privy to. He had not explained what those arrangements were. The third report had prompted nothing. She had delivered it to his desk on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday it was not possible to determine whether he had read it. She had 11 months of work in a folder. She had names, dates, specific figures, a clear account of what had happened and what it would take to correct it. 2 of the affected vendors, a Kansas plant supplier from Milwaukee named Harkins and a livestock contractor from Kansas City named Pollitt, were owed, between them, just under $400. In 1893, $400 was the kind of money that could decide whether a small operation survived or closed. Harkins had written her twice politely at first, then with a controlled desperation that she recognized, because she had heard it in her own voice. Pollitt had not written at all, which frightened her more. She had gone over Harlow's head. She had requested a meeting with the Deputy Director of Administration, a man named Sorrell, and been given one, 2 weeks after the request, in an office 2 floors up from her own, where Sorrell had listened to her for 9 minutes. She knew because there was a clock on his desk and she watched it, and then told her that the matter would be reviewed. He did not ask for the folder. He did not ask for her name again to write it down. He looked, for the last 4 minutes of the meeting, at a point approximately 8 inches above her head. She had tried the legal office. She had been told that the matters she was describing were internal accounting questions, and not in scope for the legal team's engagement. She had tried the public relations office, briefly, and without real hope, having heard from one of the other clerks that the public relations staff were occasionally effective as a route to the director's attention. The public relations officer had listened to her with great warmth and genuine incomprehension, and suggested that if she had concerns about her specific position, the Human Resources Office might be a better point of contact. She had stood on the sidewalk outside the administration building at the end of that day. It was the 14th day of October, 3 days before the shot, and understood for the first time that she was not going to be heard, not because her work was wrong. It was not wrong. She had checked it so many times that the figures came to her at 3 in the morning without being asked for. She was not going to be heard because the machinery of the organization had no mechanism for hearing someone like her, and this was not an accident. She sat on a bench and watched the exposition crowds move past, and did not cry, because she had spent her childhood learning that crying was a response to things that might change, and this was not one of those. She felt instead the specific kind of exhaustion that settles in after you have used all the resources you had, and none of them reached. That night she went back to the room she rented on Wabash Avenue and wrote 2 letters, one to Harkins and one to Pollitt, telling them that she had done everything she could, and that it had not been enough, and that she was sorry. She did not mail the letters. She put them in the drawer beneath the letters they had written her, and sat at the table in her room for a long time without moving. She went back the next day because she did not know what else to do. She went back the day after that. She did her work with the same precision she had always brought to it, and she did not speak of the reports again. And she watched the figures in the accounts she managed continue to be wrong in the ways she had documented. And she said nothing, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but was some combination of the two that had no common name. On the morning of the third day, she went to the arena. She told herself later that she had gone because she needed to be outside and away from the account books and the smell of the basement office. She told herself she had gone because she had heard people talking about the Wild West show for 8 months and had never seen it and was not likely to see it again. She told herself these things, and they were both true, and neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had spent 3 days trying to be heard and had not been heard, and she needed to be somewhere that reminded her that skill was real and that effort was real, and that it was possible, somewhere, for those things to mean something. She bought a standing room ticket for 75 cents and stood at the edge of the crowd and watched Annie Oakley perform. Before we go any further, has there been a moment in your life when you did everything right and were still turned away? When you had the evidence, the documentation, and none of it mattered to the person holding the door? Drop a comment if you know that feeling. This story is about what happens the day after that moment. We will be right here when you get back. Cole Harlan had been watching the show from the same position for 4 days. He was 57 years old, a cattle and landman from Amarillo, Texas, with enough holdings in the Texas Panhandle that people sometimes described him as a land baron, and he sometimes corrected them and sometimes did not. He was in Chicago partly on legitimate business, a land sale that had extended beyond its expected duration, and partly because he had been tired when he arrived and had found, unexpectedly, that the exposition agreed with him. He liked the crowds. He liked the improbable architecture. He liked the sense of a country looking at itself and deciding provisionally to be impressed. He had discovered the Wild West show on his second day and returned each day since, and he had told himself the first time that it was for professional reasons. He had managed working horses his whole adult life, and the horsemanship in the arena was worth study. The second day he told himself the same thing. By the fourth day he had stopped explaining it. He knew who Annie Oakley was. Anyone in his line of work who moved between cattle towns and supply depots knew the name. She was one of the most recognized faces in the country, and the stories about her were the kind that traveled. But knowing the name and watching the woman were different things. And what Wise watched in the arena was not the trick work, not the theatrics, not the spectacle that the program described. He watched how she moved between shots, how she reset, the specific quality of her stillness before she raised the rifle. Not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of a person who has made a complete peace with what they are about to do. He had spent most of his life making large decisions quickly, and what he watched in that arena was the physical embodiment of a thing he had been trying to understand for years. The relationship between preparation and precision, between the years of work and the single instant in which that work becomes visible. He was watching this, specifically, when Gerald Crace made his remark. Cole Harlan had been aware of Crace since the second performance. The man was not difficult to locate. He was the kind of man who arranged himself to be located. Harlan had watched without acting, which was his natural mode. He had heard the words about the weighted clay pigeons and the controlled distances and the mechanism at the target end. He had heard them and filed them in the category of things that were not his concern. He had watched Clara Briggs arrive at the arena that morning and take up her standing room position, and he had noticed her the way he noticed most things, completely, without appearing to. A young woman with an accounting clerk's posture, the particular forward lean of someone who had spent months at a desk, and an expression of focused attention that suggested she was not watching the show the way the tourists watched it. She was watching it the way you watch something that is telling you something important, and you are trying to hear it correctly. He had not moved when Crace made the first comments about the weighted targets. He had not moved when Crace said the distances were inflated. He had not moved during any of the earlier remarks. What moved him was a single thing, And it was not Grace at all. It was Clara Briggs's face when Grace laughed. She was 40 feet away, standing at the arena's edge, and she had been still and focused up until that moment. When Grace laughed, when the sound of it rose above the crowd noise with its particular quality of dismissal, its assumption that the thing being dismissed did not merit examination, did not merit honest engagement, was simply wrong in its premise, and could be laughed at without cost. Clara Briggs flinched, not dramatically, barely visibly. But Cole Harlan was watching, and he saw it, and he understood what it meant because he recognized it. It was the flinch of someone who has heard that particular sound too recently and too often, and has not yet built the scar tissue. He set down the program he had been holding. He did not make a decision exactly. He simply stood up. He spoke to Grace quietly, 4 sentences, in a voice that did not rise, using no dramatic language, employing only the specific weight that accumulates in a man's voice over 57 years of meaning what he says. He told Grace that this was not his audience. He told him that what he was watching was a level of skill that warranted silence. He told him that the distances were accurate because he had walked them himself on the first day. He told Grace, in the final sentence, that he was welcome to continue speaking, but that if he did, Cole Harlan would have a conversation with the arena manager about the reserved section seating. Grace said nothing. His associate said nothing. The performance continued. Harlan did not look at Clara Briggs. He walked back to his seat along the perimeter, and after the performance he waited near the exit, and when she passed he took off his hat and asked, simply, if she had a few minutes. She stopped. She looked at him with the careful eyes of someone who has been approached by strangers with offers before, and has learned to assess quickly. She did not say yes immediately. She asked what it was about. I don't know yet, he said. But I saw something in your face just now, and I think it would be worth either of our time to find out. It was not a flattering line. It was not designed to charm her. It was the kind of thing you say when you have decided to be honest and have not bothered to dress it up. And she heard that quality in it. And after a moment, she said all right. He suggested the tea room at the northeast corner of the main building. She said that was fine. Before we continue, quick thought. Where are you watching this story from? Drop your city or your state in the comments. It is always something to see where these stories land. They sat across a small table with their tea getting cold between them. He had not yet said what he wanted. He was looking at her in the direct, unhurried way of someone who is making an assessment that is not hostile but is thorough. Tell me what happened, he said. She looked at him. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do, he said. And I'm not asking to be forward. I'm asking because that flinch you had out there was about something specific, and if I'm going to be useful to you. If there's any chance I'm going to be useful to you, I need to understand what it was. She was quiet for a long time. She turned her teacup a quarter turn. Then she put both hands flat on the table and looked at him and said, How do you know you're going to be useful to me? I don't, he said. But I have been in enough rooms where people needed to be heard to recognize the look of someone who hasn't been. The teacup made a small sound as she set it back down. Outside, the exposition crowds were a continuous murmur. Somewhere in the direction of the arena, someone was testing a signal horn, she said. It is a long story. I have the afternoon, he said. So she told him. She told him about Decatur and the mathematics and the piano that had been sold, and the understanding she had grown up with that hours were the currency of distance. She told him about Chicago, about the 8 months before the exposition opened, about the position in Harlow's office. She told him about the first error she had found, a transposition in a column of figures that had caused a payment to Harkins, the canvas supplier, to be calculated at 60 cents on the dollar. An error compounded across 4 quarterly payments, totaling just under $220. She pulled the folder from her bag. She carried it everywhere now, she said, because she had learned that you never knew when you might find yourself in front of someone who might listen. And she put it on the table. He did not pick it up yet. He let her talk. She told him about the first meeting with Harlow. She described the specific words Harlow had used. The phrase arrangements you're not privy to. And she said it in a flat voice that told him more than the words themselves did. She told him about the second error and the second meeting, and the way Harlow had not quite looked at her for its entirety. She told him about the third report, the one that had gone into Harlow's in-tray and vanished. She told him about Sorrell, the deputy director, the 9-minute meeting, the clock she had watched. She said, He did not write my name down. I watched his hands the whole time. He did not once pick up a pen. There was nothing performative in the way she said this. It was a piece of evidence, clearly stated. She told him about the legal office. She told him about the public relations office, and the warmth and the incomprehension, and the suggestion about human resources. She stopped there for a moment. Harlan said, "How much between them?" "Harkins and Pollitt? $387, she said, "and some cents. And you have the documentation for both." "Everything," she said. "Every transaction, every calculation, the original figures and the correct figures, and the difference between them, and a dated record of every attempt I made to report it." He nodded slowly. He picked up his cup, found it cold, and set it down again. "When did you write the letters to them?" he said. She looked at him. "How did you know I wrote letters?" "Because that's what you do," he said. "When you've run out of official routes and you can't stop working the problem, you write to the people who are actually hurt by it and tell them where you are. Did you send them?" "No," she said. "They're in a drawer." "Why not?" She looked at the table. "Because sending them is admitting it's over." He did not say anything for a time. He turned his water glass a slow half-turn on the tablecloth. "What does Harkins's operation look like?" he said. "Do you know? He has a canvas workshop in Milwaukee. He's employed 3 men for 15 years. The underpayment is," she opened the folder without looking down, knowing exactly where the page was, $221.40 over 4 payments. "And Pollitt?" "A livestock operation outside Kansas City. Horses, primarily. The underpayment to him is $166. He hasn't written me since June. I wrote him twice. The second letter came back." Harlan said, "The second letter came back." "Yes, returned to sender, forwarded to a different address, and then returned from there." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That means he moved," Harlan said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She had not softened this detail, she had not dressed it up or down. She had stated it with the same clarity she had brought to other piece of information, and he understood that this was not detachment. It was the discipline of a person who has learned that if she lets any one piece of the story be emotional, the whole thing becomes easy to dismiss. "You've been carrying this for 11 months, he said. "Yes, and every door you went through closed. Every door, and you still came back to work every day." She looked up at him. "It's my job," she said. "The accounts are still there. The errors are still wrong. I can't make them disappear by leaving." He picked up the folder then. He opened it slowly and began to read, not skimming but reading, page by page, column by column, following her documentation the way you follow a trail. She did not explain or supplement. She let the work speak, and it did. He read for a long time. She sat across from him and watched the exposition crowds move past the window and did not hurry him. When he reached the end, he closed the folder and set it back on the table and placed his hand flat on top of it, and neither of them said anything for a while. The waiter came and refilled both cups. The afternoon light outside had shifted. "I'm going to ask you something," Harlan said, "and I'd like you to answer it straight." "All right. Have you told anyone else the whole thing? Beginning to end, the way you just told me?" She thought about it. "No. The officials I spoke to. I presented the case, the facts, the documentation. I didn't tell them about Harkins's letters. I didn't tell them about Pollitt's address." She paused. "That didn't seem relevant to the accounting problem." "But it is relevant," he said. "I know that now." He was quiet again. He turned the folder on the table so it was square with the edge. He seemed to be working something out that was not quite about her or about the accounts. "I've been in the cattle and land business for 30 years, he said. "I've made money, considerable money, and I've spent about 20 of those years telling myself that what I do generates something. Employment, reliable supply chains, economic stability in regions that don't have a lot of other pillars. I've believed that." She waited. "What I've been less honest about," he said, "is how much of what I've built rests on the kind of thing you just described. On work that was done correctly and completely by people with no power to ensure they were paid correctly for it. On accounts that were managed right by people who had exactly your ability to identify and document problems, and exactly your ability to do absolutely nothing about them without someone further up deciding to care." She said nothing. She was looking at him with a kind of careful attention, not judging, not confirming. "I don't have any Harkinses in my records," he said. "Or I don't believe I do. But I haven't had an Annie Oakley in my accounting office for 30 years either. I've had people who were competent and people who were less competent. and the ones who found problems tended to either leave quickly or accommodate themselves to the problems. And I'm not sure I ever asked which category they started in. "Are you telling me this because you feel guilty?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm telling you this because it's true, and because you've spent 11 months being in a room with people who weren't telling you the truth, and I don't want to be another one of those people." A long pause. The afternoon light in the tea room was going golden, the particular color of October in the Midwest. "I appreciate that," she said. "The guilt is also there," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't." She almost smiled. "Now," he said, "I want you to show me the column structure. Not the totals, the structure. The way you laid out the comparison between original figures and corrected figures. Walk me through how you built it." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to understand how you work," he said. "And because there's going to be a conversation tomorrow, and the way the documentation is structured will determine how it goes." She pulled the folder toward her and opened it to the page. She turned it to face him and began to explain, and as she did, something in her posture changed, not immediately, but in the way a shoulder relaxes when the weight on it is briefly redistributed. She was in her own territory. She knew this work. He listened the way he had listened in the arena, completely, without the kind of restless attention that signals someone waiting to speak. He asked specific questions. How she had identified the discrepancy between the contracted rate and the applied rate. How she had traced the compounding across quarters. Why she had structured the remediation proposal as 2 separate documents rather than one, she explained. He tried to follow the logic aloud, repeated her summary of the compounding calculation back to her in his own words. Got part of it wrong. She told him where he had gone wrong, precisely and without condescension, and he tried again, and this time he got it right, and she said, "Yes, that's it exactly." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That's a beautiful piece of work," he said. She did not respond immediately. She looked at the folder. "No one has said that to me," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the problem." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had a different weight to it. Not the silence of 2 strangers, across a table working out their footing, but the silence of 2 people who have been in a room together, long enough that the room has changed. She turned a page in the folder. She was not looking for anything specific. She was doing with her hands what her mind was doing, which was moving through the material she had lived inside for 11 months, and seeing it for the first time. Through the eyes of someone who was actually reading it. "Paulette," she said. "I think about Paulette. Tell me." He had 15 horses in that contract. Working horses, not exhibition animals. The kind of horses that do the daily work that no one watches. He contracted them to the exposition's livestock support operations for the full run, which is 6 months. He was supposed to receive $166 more than he was paid. She paused. Working horses need maintenance, feed, farrier work, veterinary attention. If you're short $166 over a 6-month contract, and you're already operating on thin margins, you make choices about what you skip, and then the horses pay for it. He was looking at her. "I know that sounds," she started. "It doesn't sound like anything except the truth," he said. She looked at the window. He moved. He moved to a different address, and then he moved again, and I think I know what that means, and I can't do anything about it. The room was very quiet for a moment. "You can now," Harlan said. She looked at him. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I need you here at 8. Bring the folder. Bring both letters you didn't send. Bring the returned envelope." He paused. "Is there anything else in that drawer?" She thought about it. "A copy of the original contract documentation. Both of them. Bring that too." She studied him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go see Annie Oakley," he said. "And then tomorrow, the 2 of us are going to go back through that door." She stared at him. "Why Annie Oakley?" He almost smiled. "Because I've been watching her for 4 days," he said. "And she knows something about what happens when a man tells you that you're going to miss." Have you ever had someone finally sit across from you and actually listen? Not wait for you to finish, but actually listen. Drop a comment if you know what that feels like. It changes the air in the room. It changes something in your chest. This story is about what that listening produces, and we are almost there. He found Annie Oakley after the evening performance. At the production end of the arena, where the crew was breaking down the target stands and running the horses out. He introduced himself, and she listened to the introduction with the polite attentiveness she gave everyone. which was complete and calibrated and gave nothing away. He told her about Clara Briggs in 2 minutes. He did not editorialize. He gave her the facts in the order they had happened, the same way Clara had given them to him. Annie Oakley had heard him out. She was quiet for a moment. She looked over his shoulder at the arena, where the crew was pulling up the last of the target posts. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want to know how you do it," he said. "Not the shooting. I watched the shooting. I want to know what you think about when a man tells you that you'll miss. Because I watched that too this afternoon. And I watched it not touch you, and I don't understand the mechanics of that." She was quiet for a moment. "Why does that matter for your accounting clerk?" "Because she is going to have to walk into a room tomorrow with people who have already decided she's wrong," he said. "And she's going to have to stand in that room and hold everything she knows without letting their certainty contaminate her own. And I think you know something about that I don't." Annie Oakley considered this. She set her rifle, the .22 Stevens, still warm, against the wall behind her. "The man who laughs," she said, "is telling you something about himself. He's telling you what he needs to be true. He needs you to miss because the alternative, that you're going to hit it, cleanly, without difficulty, after 20 years of doing exactly this, requires him to take what you do seriously, and that costs him something he isn't willing to pay." She paused. "So when I hear the laugh, I don't hear contempt. I hear the particular sound of someone who is afraid of being wrong." He considered that. "And that helps you?" "It clarifies the target," she said. "The shot isn't about him. It never was. He made himself relevant by laughing, and I made him irrelevant by not noticing. Those two things happened at the same time." "Your girl in the accounting office," she said after a moment. "She has the documentation." "Impeccable," he said. "Then she has the shot," Annie Oakley said. "She's already made it. The only question is whether she can hold the rifle level while the man laughs." She looked at him. "You're going in with her?" "Yes." "Then you're the anchor," she said. "You stand between her and the sound of the laugh. Not literally. You just be the person in the room who already knows she's going to hit it. She'll feel that. It's not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what Frank does for you," he said. "Your husband." She looked at him steadily. "He believes in what I can do," she said. "Not as charity, as the result of having watched me work for 12 years. That's different from being encouraged. Encouragement is about feeling. Frank's belief is based on evidence. And evidence," she paused, "evidence is what she has, too. Don't let her forget that tomorrow." He thanked her. She picked up the rifle again and did not say she was welcome, because it was not the kind of conversation that ended that way. He walked back through the fairground in the evening crowd, past the electric lights and the impossible white buildings, and the hundreds of thousands of people, all looking at some version of the future they wanted to inhabit. And he thought about evidence, and evidence as its own answer, and the specific kind of courage it took to hold a rifle level. When the crowd went quiet, and the man who needed you to miss was already halfway through his laugh. The next morning, Clara Briggs was at the tea room at 5 minutes to 8 with the folder and both letters and the returned envelope and the contract documentation. He arrived at 8. He looked at what she had laid out and said, "Good." He did not say anything else about the documents. He told her what Annie Oakley had said, not every word, but the substance of it. He told her about the laugh and what it announced, about the man who needs you to miss, about the difference between encouragement and evidence-based belief. She listened to this without expression. At the end, she said, "You talked to Annie Oakley about my accounting reports." "I talked to Annie Oakley about what you're going to feel in that room," he said. She looked at the table. Then she said, "All right." They went to the administration building at 9 o'clock. Harlan had sent a note the previous evening, not a request, a statement of schedule. He was Cole Harlan, and he had held 5,000 acres in the Texas Panhandle for 30 years. And when he sent a note saying he would be meeting with the director of Exposition Finances at 9 the following morning regarding a financial compliance matter, the meeting was on the calendar by 7 a.m. The director was a man named Aldrich. He was not Harlow. He was 3 levels above Harlow, which was the point. He was 60, formal, accustomed to meetings with men like Cole Harlan. And he had the particular alertness of someone who knows he is about to be presented with an inconvenience, but does not yet know its shape. Clara Briggs sat beside Harlan at the conference table. She put the folder in front of her and her hands on the folder, and she looked at Aldrich with the clear, level expression of someone who has decided to treat the room as a target. and herself as what she was. "My associate has a presentation to make," Harlan said. "I'm here as a witness." He said nothing else for the next 40 minutes. Clara Briggs presented the findings. She walked through every calculation, every transaction, every dated entry in her documentation record. She presented the comparison columns, original figures and corrected figures, and she explained the compounding mechanism, and she named both vendors, and she read, from a copy she had prepared, the text of the letters she had not sent. Then she opened the returned envelope and placed it flat on the table where Aldrich could see it. She said, in a voice that did not rise, "The man who may have lost his operation because of this underpayment is named Pollitt. He had 15 horses. I don't know where he is now, but I know what he was owed, and I know that the record shows it, and I know that the organization has had 11 months of documented notice and has chosen not to act." She paused. "I am not asking for my own account. I am asking that these two vendors be made whole. The amounts are in the summary 4. Aldrich looked at the summary on page 4. He looked at Harlan. Harlan looked back at him and did not say anything. Aldrich called for Harlow. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes. Harlow arrived and turned the color of old chalk, and said twice that there were arrangements that had not been fully communicated to junior staff. And Clara Briggs, each time, turned to the page in the documentation that showed exactly what the arrangements in question had actually been, and read it aloud without commentary. When Harlow stopped talking, Aldrich was quiet for a long time. "Miss Briggs," he said, "what would you need to resolve these accounts?" She did not look at Harlan. She had not looked at him once during the presentation. She said, "Allerization and a checkbook." He gave her both. Cole Harlan stood up before she finished writing. He took his hat from the table. He shook Aldrich's hand and said one sentence, "You have an exceptional employee," and walked to the door. Clara Briggs looked up from the checks she was writing. "Mr. Harlan." He turned. She held his gaze for a moment. She did not say the full thing she was thinking. He could see it in her face, the fullness of it, all the months of it pressing against the back of whatever she was about to say. "Thank you," she said. 2 words said plainly. The way she said everything. He nodded once, put on his hat, and walked out before she could say anything else. A clerk in the hallway had watched the whole thing through the glass and did not speak to his colleague until Cole Harlan had turned the corner at the end of the hall. Then he said quietly, "What was that?" His colleague shook his head. Neither of them had an answer. The check for Harkins arrived in Milwaukee 6 days later. It was $311, $221.40 in corrected payment, plus interest calculated at the standard rate for the period of underpayment. Harkins read it twice and then sat down at the work table in his canvas shop and put his hand over his face for a moment, and then called to his foreman to come in from the floor. The check for Pollitt took longer. The address on the contract was obsolete, and the forward address was a postal station in a small town outside Topeka, Kansas, where a postal clerk held mail for people who no longer had a fixed address. Clara Briggs wrote to the postal station. Weeks passed. A response came. The postal clerk had a current address for Pollitt, in a different town entirely. The check arrived on a Tuesday in December. Pollitt was working as a stable hand at a freight operation near Lawrence, Kansas. He had lost the horse contract, and with it the means to maintain his animals. And by September he had sold all but 3 of the 15 horses. He read the letter that came with the check 3 times before he understood what it was. He wrote a letter back to the return address, which was Clara Briggs's address on Wabash Avenue. The letter said, "I didn't know someone was trying. I want you to know that matters." She kept letter. The following spring, Harlow was removed from his position. This was the result of a broader compliance review that the Aldrich meeting had indirectly precipitated. Not the only factor, but a factor. Clara Briggs was offered a senior accounting position in the reconstituted administration. She took it, and in the new position she supervised 3 junior accounting clerks, and the first thing she did with each of them was sit down across a table and ask them to tell her about any discrepancy they had found and been unable to resolve. She ran those meetings for 11 years. In 1904, she left the accounting field to open a financial consulting practice in Chicago, specializing in the administration of exhibitions and commercial shows. A niche so specific and so thoroughly hers that within 4 years she had no effective competition. She had 15 clients within 5 years, including 2 Wild West touring companies, a railroad exhibition, and a circus operation out of Cincinnati. She was known among her clients for a particular quality. She found things, not opportunities exactly, though she found those too. But the structural pressures in an operation, the places where the accounts told a different story from the one the management believed, the quiet underpayments and overlooked obligations that accumulated in any complex financial machine, until someone with the right kind of eye looked directly at them. She trained 12 accounting clerks over the course of her practice. She told each of them, on their first day, one thing. The work you do is not less real because no one is watching it. Document everything. The documentation is the argument you are having with the future. One of the 12 was a young woman from Springfield named Helen Morrow, who came to Clara in 1909. With a gift for financial analysis and a near-total inability to be heard in rooms full of men, Clara trained her for 3 years and then helped her establish her own practice in St. Louis, and Helen Morrow ran that practice for 30 years and became, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most technically accomplished financial analysts in the Midwest. Cole Harlan went back to Amarillo in the autumn of 1893 and within a month had asked his accounting office to conduct a full compliance review of every vendor contract going back 5 years. The review took 3 months. It found 4 material underpayments, none as large as Harkins's but real. He made them whole quietly, without announcement. He did not tell anyone why he had ordered the review. He wrote it in a letter, once, to his oldest daughter. A single paragraph, explaining that he had watched a young woman in Chicago hold 20 years of effort in front of a man who was already halfway through his laugh, and that it had changed the way he thought about what his money was built on. His daughter kept the letter. When she died in 1941, she left it to her own daughter, who had it framed. The framed letter hung in her office in Houston for 30 years. Visitors who read it would sometimes ask about it, and she would tell them the story, as her mother had told her. And when she reached the part about the arena, she would say, "He watched Annie Oakley hold the rifle level and understand that the man laughing had nothing to do with the shot. And he took that understanding back to a girl who had been trying to be heard for 11 months, and he stood in the room while she said what she knew. And because of that, 2 men got paid what they were owed, and one of them didn't lose everything." The letter had no heading and no formal date. It began mid-thought, the way letters do when the writer has something specific to say. It ended, "I have been in the room where the work was good and the door was closed, and I know now that what I should have done sooner was simply be willing to read the folder." Clara Briggs died in 1939, at 72, in the house she had owned on the north side of Chicago since 1907. Among her papers sorted after her death by her nephew was a folder of documents from 1893, account ledgers, correction summaries, correspondence records, and 2 letters never sent, and 1 letter received, and a returned envelope with 2 addresses crossed out and a 3rd written in a stranger's hand. Her nephew did not understand what he was looking at. He kept it anyway, because it was clearly the kind of thing that had been kept deliberately. The folder is not in any archive. It is in a box in a family home in Illinois, which is where most of the true records of things that mattered end up, not in museums, not on plaques, but in the careful custody of people who understood that something had been saved. Annie Oakley continued with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show through 1901, performing before 4-crowned heads and open-mouthed crowds across 2 continents, never missing more than she chose to miss and never once allowing the laugh in the reserved section to change the angle of the shot. She lived until 1926, and Frank Butler outlived her by 18 days. And what they were to each other was exactly what she had described to Cole Harlan in the autumn of 1893. Not encouragement, which is about feeling, but belief based on evidence, which is the rarer and more durable thing. The moral here is not complicated, but it is easy to miss precisely because it looks simple. A woman did her work with complete accuracy, and no one listened for 11 months. A man sat in a room and read her folder, and told her the work was beautiful. This did not fix the injustice on its own. She fixed the injustice, in a conference room, using her own voice and her own documentation. But the reading of the folder made the conference room possible. The willingness to be present for the full account, not the summary, not the headlines, but the column structure, and the returned envelope, and the name of a man who might have lost his horses, is what turned 11 months of invisible work into something the future could hear. There are people in your life right now who are holding a folder. They have the work, They have the documentation. They have been through every door and come back and gone through the next one and come back from that too. They are not asking to be rescued. They are asking to be read. Pick up the folder. That is all. Pick it up and read it and say, "This is a beautiful piece of work," and then stand in the room while they hold the rifle level. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to this channel. We put out a new story every week about the men and women of the American frontier who did the difficult, invisible, lasting thing. Leave a comment below. Who in your life is holding a folder right now? We would like to know. And we will be right here next week.